Hi, welcome to What Can Your Blood Test Really Tell You About Your Health? My name is Barbara Solomon. I'm a board certified nutrition specialist and certified functional medicine practitioner. What we're going to talk about today is what you can learn about your health from the standard tests that are taken by your doctors when you go for your physical. So first of all, we have to start with a disclaimer as always. The following is for information only and is not intended to be used to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any illness. That's for your doctor to do. This should not be considered medical advice and is not a substitute for care by a licensed medical doctor. So let's get started. First of all, I'm going to apologize up front that this is a really long presentation. So what we're going to do is break this down. Now, basically, the first part of the lecture, I'm going to really talk about the differences of how we read blood from a functional perspective versus how blood is read when you go to your doctor's office. So if you're not interested in that, skip. The next part is going to be an example on how we use this with one of my clients. And if you're not interested in that, skip ahead. And then the third part, we're going to talk about these common health issues that we can see from blood testing, but we can catch them earlier. And that's the whole point of a functional approach to reading blood, is to catch things early before it has a chance to turn into a serious health issue. Okay, so we're going to talk about three key things: dehydration, low stomach acid, and blood sugar regulation. Again, you're interested in any of those things? Just skip right over to that part. Okay, so let's get started. First of all, we're going to look at things from a functional medicine approach. And what I like about functional medicine approach is that the idea is to look for health or dysfunction rather than just focusing on a specific disease. And in doing that, we're looking at how the body is overall. We're looking at detoxifications and hormones and how your mind influences things and how your diet influences things. And do you have infections? Or do you have inflammation? And you can see one of these feeds off the other and they affect the other. So you can't just look at your body from one perspective. It's much more to your benefit to do this from a combined approach so that you can find underlying health issues.
When we talk about health, we should be talking about vitality and not just the absence of some disease. And that's why we test. We're trying to find dysfunction before it has an opportunity to turn into something bigger. So these blood tests or biomarkers, they give us an indication of your health status, and signs and symptoms can be different for everyone. They also act as a check engine light so that we can take preventative measures. And for folks that are interested in genetics, testing provides information on how your genes are being expressed based on your lifestyle choices. So how is this approach different than the approach taken by many other practitioners? It's really in the way that we review the data. When we talk about markers or tests, these represent the health of a particular system or function in the body. So when your doctor looks at these test results, oftentimes they'll just look at this marker and decide if there's an issue they need to address. Functional medicine is a little bit different. What we take into account is the fact that each of these markers here represent the health of a system, like we mentioned, but they also influence one another. They don't operate in isolation. Therefore, if we look at the markers and how they play off one another, we can detect patterns that represent certain conditions or dysfunctions in health. And then if we combine that with your signs and symptoms and your medical history, we have a better chance of finding out the root cause of what's going on with any health concerns that you may have. Now, a couple different ways that we evaluate the data is the way that we look at it in terms of being sick and being okay. When you go to the doctor, you get back the test results and they say they're okay, you're normal, or you're sick. Functionally, what we want to do is we want to look at not only are you okay or are you sick, but is there some optimal place that you may need to be? So that way we can determine if there are some interventions that we need to make if you're marginal. So this is basically how it looks. You go to the doctor's office and they look at these laboratory ranges and they say in, out, high, low, disease, disease-free. These labs are based on the population that's visited the facility in the last year. And as we know, that's not a bunch of healthy people going in and getting testing. These are people that have challenges to their health. Because of that, these ranges tend to change every year. They get wider and wider and wider as the population is getting sicker and sicker and sicker. So the idea behind functional health or functional medicine is to take these ranges and look at your test results based on healthy individuals. These data ranges were taken from Dr. Harry Eidner, and they represent the health of 10,000 healthy individuals. So we can look at your test results or your markers and see where you reside with healthy individuals, and we can also look at your past test data and determine, well, maybe you're not even in this functional range. Maybe you're just operate a little bit differently. So we can get an idea of what your normal should be. The final thing that we do is we order a more comprehensive panel. And basically, I honestly think that's where our clinical success comes from, because if you don't test, you can't find things. It's not enough to go, I suspect that you have a problem with this, but you also need to see, well, what don't you have a problem with so you can rule out other things. So what can we look for? What do we look for when we do this functional blood chemistry analysis? That's the name of the methodology. And we can see things going on at GI. We can look at stomach acid and if your pancreas is potentially breaking down foods, if there's malabsorption or leaky gut. We look at the immune system. We can look for different types of bacteria and viruses and parasites and whether there might be some potential autoimmune. We can look at your lipid panel and look at your cardiovascular risk. We can look at liver and gallbladder and kidney blood sugar, and the list goes on. So basically we're looking at thyroid and adrenals and folate, B12, iron issues, oxygenation issues, or anemias is what the doctors refer that to. You can even find out about hydration. We'll talk about that a little bit. Specific nutrients that we might be missing. You don't see all of them, but you can see patterns. And usually if there's one or two that are showing up, there might be a reason. And then you can start to look a little bit more in depth as to why that's happening. And we like to look for inflammation. Inflammation, blood sugar swings are a huge problem and really the underlying cause of why we're seeing so much dysfunction in health today.
Here's our example of how this whole thing works. Here's Mary. She's an actual client. She's 35 years old. She's actually a yoga instructor, so she exercises regularly, more than regularly, in a really good, healthy way. She has a great diet. Overall, she feels good, but all of a sudden she started gaining weight, and she started having muscle pains, and she started to have a lot of fatigue. Very uncommon for her. So we look at that, we look at those are her complaints, and we look at some signs and symptoms. We see, wow, she craves sweets and she loses energy. She's hungry after she eats. She's not breaking down her food as well as she used to. She goes to the bathroom a lot. She has a lot of dysfunction with eating, gas and belching, and she has a fuzzy tongue. She's sensitive to things, mood swings, acne, and her muscles for being a yoga instructor have become really tight. So what did we find? Here's the laboratory results. You can see, if we kind of look beneath this blue box, there were some markers in yellow and there were some markers in red. The markers in yellow are outside of the functional ranges. The markers in red are outside of the laboratory ranges. So looking at this from a laboratory perspective, the things that we saw was she had very low vitamin D and she had low active thyroid hormone. Now, active means that they've taken the thyroid hormone produced by the thyroid and they've converted it into something the body actually uses. And in her case, the doctor said, well, don't even worry about it because you're making thyroid hormone. Don't even worry about that T3. Well, we worry about that T3 because that's the thing that makes you tired. That's the thing that gives you dry hair and dry skin and makes you gain weight and all of those other things. So I think it's a pretty significant finding. Functionally, we look and find a lot more. We find she has problems with blood sugar regulations and she has some underlying infection. Definitely some issues going on with her guts, low B vitamins. She's a little bit acidic. She has some problems with iron deficiency. She has some problems with B12 and folates, possible parasites. Again, that conversion issue that we saw. It looks like signs of a bacterial infection as well as the low vitamin D. As we said, well, how relevant are these findings? And so we did some advanced testing. And not in all cases, you don't need to do the advanced testing, but I want to show you how this thing plays out and how it correlates. And when we did the gut testing, we found, hey, she has an H. pylori infection. That's really significant. That will affect the hydrochloric acid in your gut. And that will keep you from breaking down your foods and absorbing your minerals. Well, no wonder why she's having problems with malabsorption and she's tired. She had an overgrowth of opportunistic bacteria. She also had an underlying parasite infection. She has a problem with gluten. She has an anti-gliadin antibody. She has extremely high inflammation in her gut, and she has a low immune system in her gut. So wow, we caught a good part of that just by looking at the blood. Next, we look at organic acids, which are a way to see what metabolic processes are working within the body. In this case, we just wanted to follow up to see how accurate the blood was because, it's all a science experiment. And we found the bacterial infection again. We found the low folate in B12 and 6, those oxygenation issues. We found low neurotransmitters, and that could be a lot of the low dopamine, maybe for the motivation. There could be problems with serotonin. We found inflammation, low B vitamins, and issues with methylation, which can definitely contribute to the signs and symptoms that she's having. Finally, in her particular case, we had some genetic data to back off, and we want to see if there's any genetic basis for the signs and symptoms that she's having. And she found she had SNPs for celiac. Remember, we talked about anti-gliadin. That doesn't necessarily mean celiac disease, but she does have a genetic probability or potential for getting celiac disease. She had an issue with oxalates, which means she can create inflammation in her gut as well as keep you from absorbing your minerals. She had gut sensitivity issues, peanut sensitivity, problems with lactose, histamine, which can create leaky gut, inflammation in the gut, problems with bringing in fat assimilation, the vitamin A and that low vitamin D that we saw in the blood. Problems with methylation, and again, the neurotransmitters were caught.
So let's go ahead and talk about some of the things that you can potentially see in your blood that's not normally found during your doctor's visit. And so what we're going to talk about first is dehydration. Now, who would have thought that you could see dehydration in the blood? The doctors do look for a marker called BUN that can tell dehydration, but there's a few other markers that might give us some indication that what's going on. Water is really important for the body. It makes up most of our body mass. It removes waste products. It transports hormones and chemical messengers and nutrients around the body. It participates in lots of chemical reactions and help maintain cell structure. And if you have issues with dehydration, you could have problems with your health. Things like heartburn and asthma and stomach pain and arthritis and migraines and fibromyalgia or colitis and hangovers. You can see the list is quite extensive. Water is super important. So in addition to looking at a BUN marker, another way that you can look for potential dehydration patterns that show up much earlier are the shifts in the size and quantity of our red blood cells. So what we're going to look at markers called hemoglobin, which is right here. We're going to look at a marker called hematocrit and red blood cells. And when these markers are higher than the functional range, we're not talking about the laboratory ranges here, we're talking about the functional ranges. And when the majority of these markers are higher in the functional range, you may have a problem with dehydration.
I think it's really important to understand why. So let's look at this. When you go to the lab, they draw a vial of blood, and you can see that off to the left. They take that vial of blood and they spin it, and what happens is all the solids or all the red blood cells fall to the very bottom of the tube, and you can see that denoted by the brown part in the tube. Then there's a layer of white blood cells, and then above that is the liquid part, and that's what we're interested in. So let's look at an example. And again, I apologize, I'm not an artist, so I don't draw very well, but let's look at the quantity. Let's look at example number 2. So you can see that when they span down the sample over on the left, that's an average amount of red blood cells. There's lots of blue, there's lots of liquid, there's lots of hydration going on here. But if you have a lot of red blood cells like what's seen over to the right, notice how little liquid is available, and therefore that might be somebody that's dehydrated.
Other ways that you can determine if you're dehydrated. There's a bioimpedance analysis test that many practitioners use, and that's fantastic for telling your water status. It also tells you where the water is located in the body, if the water's inside the cells where all the metabolic reaction can occur, or if it's outside of the cells. So that's a great test. It also gives you some indication of the cell membrane, if it has the ability to even hold the hydration in. Great test. I really highly recommend it. But you can be doing things very simply at home, like looking at the color of your urine. Assuming you're not taking high doses of B vitamins or any multivitamin that contains B2, because that will cause your urine to be bright yellow, but just a standard urine test, if you can look at the color and see, hey, we're looking for something that is no darker than number 3. If it's darker than number 3, there's a potential issue with dehydration. There's another test you can do right here where we're talking called the skin turgor test. And basically what happens is if you pull the skin up on the top of your hand and that tint doesn't fall down right away, there's chances are that you might be dehydrated. Now, the body needs water. We basically need 2 to 3 quarts per day. That averages out to 8 to 12 glasses. And some of that is contained in food, some of that is contained outside of that. But that's a lot of water. But there's a reason why that is. Because looking at this, breathing takes up 1 1/3 cup. Intestines take up a 1/2 cup. Lungs 2 cups. Kidneys, they're flushing all the waste products going through your kidneys, 5.5 cups, and your skin alone is using 2 cups. Think about how much we sweat, how much loss we have, and that adds up to the amount that we're recommending per day. Now, it may not be enough that you're just drinking enough water. A lot of people find that they start to urinate more or that they just can't seem to hold the water in. Your cell membranes have to be able to hold the water in. And so it's important to make sure that you have good essential fatty acids and that you're minimizing your consumption of hydrogenated or hydrogenated fats, that you have good vitamin and minerals. And other times we may need to do something called structuring our water, which is just changing the electrical property of it. You can do that by putting water out in the sun and letting it sit for 30 minutes. You can put it in the cool it by putting it in the freezer for a very short period of time, taking it out, taking a spoon and stirring vigorously. You can find out information on that about PubMed. They talk about structured water. So that's something you can do to make it more absorbable to your body. You can also consider adding salt if you don't have a problem with blood pressure, because as we need to increase our water hydration status, we'll also need to do a little bit of salt, but make sure you talk to your doctor about this before you go in and increase your quantities. The next condition I want to talk about is something called hypochlorhydria. And this is this condition of having lower stomach acid. And stomach acid is really important. We'll talk about that in a second. But here's some of the symptoms that you might experience. Bloating, belching, burning, or gas within 1 hour of eating, sense of fullness after a meal, feeling uncomfortably full after just eating a regularly sized meal, having bad breath quite frequently, indigestion, diarrhea, constipation, undigested food in your stools, maybe you have problems with food sensitivities, intolerances, or allergies, nausea after taking supplements, are your nails cracked, peeling, weak, do you have white spots, have you lost your ability to taste or smell, does your skin have eczema, does it have patches of different kinds of colors, do you have rosacea, psoriasis, and maybe you even have something like rectal itching or dilated capillaries in your cheeks and nose, or acne or chronic infections. If so, you may have problems with the level or the acidity of gut. Now, hydrochloric acid can lead to impaired digestion, and that's because without having the proper acid levels, we can't absorb our food correctly, so it tends to sit there and putrefy in the gut. And it can also, other things that can happen with low hydrochloric acid is that it can weaken the sphincter or the valve between the stomach and the esophagus. So that can allow this vapor or this gas to come up that can cause this burning and indigestion for people that experience gastric reflux. If we don't have good hydrochloric acid, we can't signal the release of our digestive enzymes. And you may find that you have a problem breaking down foods. You may have a problem with bloating. You may find that you have undigested foods in your stool. Without hydrochloric acid, we can't absorb our nutrients, which are essential for metabolic processes throughout the body. We can't release B12, and we also have the increased risk of infection since we don't sterilize our food so well. When these things start to happen and we have these higher levels of stomach acid, we allow bad bacteria in the body to start to flourish. The ratio of good bacteria to bad bacteria is usually 80-20, and this can become imbalanced if we don't have the things that we need in order to keep these bad populations under control. Eventually, these bad bacteria will release toxins, and that starts to overwhelm the body, and it starts to also, the overall process starts to lead to leaky gut, and then we can start experiencing problems where we have inflammation due to partially processed foods leaving this encapsulated gut area now going out to the rest of the body. And unfortunately, that has been shown to lead to chronic diseases like arthritis and autoimmune and fibromyalgia and a lot of the things that people are experiencing today. So why are we having low stomach acid issues? Now, aging is a natural process, but as we find that over 60, half of the folks start to have problems with hydrochloric acid. And by the age 85, you end up losing about 80% of your ability to be able to produce hydrochloric acid. And this is why it's important to make sure that we consume things like bitters and make sure that our vagus nerve is very healthy, because these things help promote the release of hydrochloric acid. Now, the next thing that comes in is stress, and it is one of the most important things that can do to shut down hydrochloric acid. If we think about the body's stress response, the body is designed to run away from stress. It doesn't realize if it's emotional, spiritual, or if you're dehydrated or you don't have the right amount of vitamins. What it does is it releases a little bit of adrenaline so that we can dilate our eyes and send oxygen out to our lungs, and we can bring sugar to the places we need to go, like our muscles, and it affects calcium channels and all these different things. But the things we don't want to be doing if we're trying to run away from this perceived stress, this saber-toothed tiger, is to be producing sex hormones and digesting our food. Those things can wait. We need to worry about the things that are happening in this moment. And because of that, if you're under some type of stress, the body will release less hydrochloric acid and it'll slow down the whole digestive process. Now, if you overeat, that can exhaust the stomach because it has to concentrate these hydrogen ions 4 million times more than the arterial blood. So it's very important to make sure that you're eating in the correct quantities and that you're eating the right amount of foods, because if you're eating lots of carbohydrates, that's going to really cause a problem with release of these enzymes and breaking down this for the body to do its functions. I apologize for my stuttering. Finally, lack of nutrients. There are some important nutrients that are required to even produce HCl, and that's zinc and B1, very, very important. certain drugs you can take, such as antacids and birth control pills. Like in our example, the woman Mary was on birth control pills, and that was one thing that contributed besides the H. pylori infection. And things like antidepressants and antihistamines can also affect the release of hormones that deal with HCl. Lack of sufficient protein. This is required to stimulate that release of hydrochloric acid, and so we need that. We need to make sure we have good hydrochloric acid so that we can have a pH differential, so that once the body realizes, yeah, we got some food in there, we got some acidity in there, then the body can then start to release bicarbonate, so you can move that food from the stomach into the small intestine. You can continue the breaking it down. Vagus nerve, super, super important. It connects the brain with the stomach brain, and vagus nerve problems will lead to a lack of release of hydrochloric acid. So these are some big things, plus hormone levels can affect it as well. Let's look at the pattern next. Here's where we're going to look at these 4 markers here. Now we're going to look at the marker total protein, globulin, BUN, and phosphorus. In total protein and globulin, we're going to look outside again of the functional ranges. Again, we're not looking for laboratory issues, we're looking for functional issues. And in this particular case, total protein or globulin can go high or low. And this is going to depend on the amount of putrefaction that's occurring at the gut. So these are 2 big markers. These can also be indicative of leaky gut as well, just something to keep in mind. Now, when we look then at BUN, blood urea nitrogen, and phosphorus, if BUN is low and phosphorus is low, these are the clinical patterns of someone that might have issues with hydrochloric acid. And this is when you want to see your doctor or see your practitioner or do some of the tests we're going to talk about in a moment to determine if this is something that affects you. There's a couple methods that we can use, and one of the methods you can actually use is your tongue. And Chinese medicine shows that if there is a split or a crack in the tongue right here, that may mean that you have a problem with low levels of hydrochloric acid. You can also use apple cider vinegar, and what you can do is dilute 1 teaspoon of vinegar in some water and drink that with your meals, and you can gradually increase that up to about 10 teaspoons, and you can see if that reduces some of the signs and symptoms. If you have gastric reflux, if you have problems with your gut, if that seems to help with those problems. Now, if instead it causes burning, you can neutralize that with drinking some goat milk or making sure that you take some baking soda and water. We don't want you to sit and suffer because you did this little bit of a test. But very rarely have I had anybody have any real big problems with taking vinegar with their meals. It's really important to do so. The other thing you can do if you don't like the taste of vinegar is you can actually go out and buy some betaine HCl tablets, and you can start with 1 tablet a meal and see if that makes you feel better. And again, you can slowly build up the number of tablets until you note any burning them back down. If you require some betaine HCl with your meals, chances are you have low hydrochloric acid. There is a salivary pH test you could do at home with some pH paper, and you could look at your morning pH. And it should be fairly acidic because you've been doing all kinds of metabolic processes throughout the evening. And then you can test an hour or so after, half an hour or so after eating. And if it's increased by 2 whole numbers, that's good. But if the second number is lower and the first reading was less than 6.5, chances are you might need some hydrochloric acid. So that's just something to point out. So we're going to look at methods for detecting H. pylori, because for the younger population and for a lot of people, H. pylori is a significant issue. And so the doctors can run a serum antibody test. The issue with using serum is it's an effective test, but it will show you if you've had a past exposure. It won't necessarily tell you if it's currently happening, because you're going to develop antibodies so that the immune system can try to fight this off. And antibodies just don't disappear overnight. So it doesn't necessarily let you know if there's an active infection. It lets you just know if you have one or had one. There's something called the urea breath test, and it is a very, very accurate test, up to 99%, and it's very specific to H. pylori. I don't like it so much because you have to breathe in some radioactive isotope, which they say are safe, but I just don't like the sound of this radioactive isotope. So what I tend to use in my practice is the stool antigen test, and I use DNA testing. They actually take a stool sample and they look for DNA fragments of this pathogen right here, and they see if it's present and detected, and if so, then we know that there's an active infection. They say 98 to 99% effective, so that works for me right there. And then finally, there is something that the doctors can use, and it's called a Heidelberg capsule test, and you actually swallow this, and this is where they can tell too what your hydrochloric acid levels are. But you actually swallow this test, and then you wait for it to come out, and you retrieve it, and you return it back to the doctor. And it's not such a fun test, and it's pretty expensive, but it's an accurate test, so this is something that you can do. So while you're waiting to determine root cause, or while you're trying to determine root cause, there are certain things you can go ahead to do to help heal your gut. And what we could do is something called the 4R protocol. Most functional medicine practitioners use this. It's remove, replace, repair, and reinoculate. So by removing, we're talking about removing things that cause inflammation in the gut. This could be pathogens. These can be specific foods that you know give you issues. So if you go on my website there and look under food sensitivities or food intolerances, there'll be a list of foods that may promote inflammation in the body that you may want to try to remove. In the meantime, you want to make sure that the foods that you are eating that you can digest and assimilate. So what you can do is add in some hydrochloric acid or apple cider vinegar like we discussed. You can add in digestive enzymes and see if those help break down those foods. If you have issues with fats, you may want to choose something like ox bile that could help you break those down, or other supplements that will help you with fat absorption. So there are things you can do right away to support good gut function. The next thing I like to do is repair that gut if it's leaky or if it has some inflammation. Now you can do that with L-glutamine, which may not be the best choice for some folks because they might have a problem with an enzyme called GAD. You can do things like sodium butyrate that are contained in butter that are very, very healing to the gut. There's hydrolyzed fish protein. There's lots of different products out there that can help soothe a gut that is a little bit inflamed. And then once you get your gut healed a little bit, what you can try to do if you desire is to add in some probiotics. These probiotics will help rebalance the gut flora, but I don't tend to use those right away without healing the gut a little bit first, because you could have some die-off, and then if you do have some leakiness, then that can spread, out the bloodstream out to the rest of the body and maybe not make you feel so well. All right, so that's kind of what we want to talk about when we talk about gut. Now I want to talk about blood sugar regulation. Even though it's something that the doctors are going to look at your blood test and go, yeah, you have some issues with, high blood sugar or low blood sugar, but this is really important because when we have issues with blood sugar, we're seeing a huge insurgence in the amount of diabetes in this country and now around the world. So getting your blood sugar under control is really important. Blood sugar is so well regulated by the body that we have 1 gallon of blood on our overall body, and there's only 1 teaspoon of sugar, and it regulates that very, very closely. So let's look at some signs and symptoms of someone that may have issues with low blood sugar. Now this could be headache or shaking or sweating and feeling tired. Do you get irritable and lightheaded and shaky between meals? Do you feel energized after you eat? Does your energy drop in the afternoon? Do you crave sweets in the afternoon? Do you wake up in the middle of the night, often between 2 to 4? Do you have trouble concentrating before you eat? Do you have to depend on coffee to keep you going? Do you feel agitated or easily upset or nervous between meal? Basically, does eating make you feel better? And if that's the case, you may have issues with low blood. And what we'll see in the blood, in this particular case, we're going to try to find issues early rather than wait on the laboratory ranges, and we're going to look at a couple markers right here. Now, blood glucose is a 24-hour marker, so it really represents kind of what happened in the past, but really we like it to be between 85 and 100, and the docs will let you go down to about 65, which is a true hypoglycemia. We don't want you to get to that point. We want to keep this thing nice and steady and stable. The other marker we look at is something called LDH, which is an enzyme, and it tends to go below 140 for those that have problems with these blood sugar swings that are going way too high and then way, way, way too low. Another marker that's often used is called hemoglobin A1C, and this is a great marker. The issue with hemoglobin A1C is that if you're really low, below 4.8, you have potentially low blood sugar issues, but hemoglobin A1C is also dependent on the lifespan of a red blood cell, and it's also dependent on anemia and and B vitamin levels. So hemoglobin A1C may give you an indication of what's happening. This is a marker that shows blood sugar over the last 120 days, so it gives you an average, but it may not be 100% accurate. So I like to use another marker called fasting insulin, and I like to make sure that that's somewhere between not less than 3. If it's less than 3, we may know, we're having a little bit of problem with insulin levels. So very important. We need the pancreas to be able to release insulin so that we can get the sugar in. So just something to consider. Now, Now, there's also the case, instead of having low blood sugar, is you may have higher levels of blood sugar. And this would be the person that gets fatigued after meals, and they crave sugar and sweets after meals, and they feel like they need coffee or stimulants right after the meal. And their waist size seems to be increasing, maybe even larger than their hips. They're urinating a lot. They have thirst and appetite that increases. They gain a lot of weight under stress, and they have problems falling asleep. And the idea is basically, does eating make you feel worse? And what I mean by that, not gas and bloating, that's a whole different situation. I mean, an hour or two after you eating, are you feeling tired and just exhausted and you just need a pick-me-up? And that may mean that you're becoming insulin resistant and the sugar may not be heading into the. There's some patterns that we can see. Now, in this particular case, again, glucose and hemoglobin A1C, so your glucose levels you want below 100, just like the laboratory ranges. Hemoglobin A1C, this varies on the lab. This was done, I probably made this slide years ago, so now it's at 5.6. You can tell every year it changes. I'm sorry. It's at 5.8 now. It used to be 5.6, so we'll just say hemoglobin A1C might be a problem at 5.7. But again, the numbers aren't so important if you look at the overall patterns. The idea is this: if the sugar doesn't go into the cells, it's got to go somewhere. And what it's going to do is it's going to get converted into fats, and you're going to start seeing elevations in cholesterol and triglycerides and potentially LDL, and then HDL might drop down as this continues to progress. So we really want to watch these type of patterns. Again, elevated sugars, elevated blood lipids. You can also look at elevations in uric acid. You can look at elevations in fasting insulin. Again, hemoglobin A1C may not be your best choice. There was a study published in the Diabetics Journal where researchers found that the lifetime of hemoglobin A1C or hemoglobin cells of diabetics could be as low as 81 days. Whereas in non-diabetics was 146 days. Therefore, a person with normal blood sugar has their hemoglobin in the bloodstream for a longer period of time, and therefore their hemoglobin A1C levels will go high. So again, just something to consider when your doctor talks to you about hemoglobin A1C. Now, what are the key cells? So let's look at this. When we have a meal that's been well balanced, protein, carbohydrates, and fats, you can see that there are sugars. The sugars in this case are going to be these red dots right here. And when the body detects a certain level of blood sugar, it'll release a hormone called insulin, and those are indicated by these blue dots right here. And so what happens is the body will go ahead and dock itself, this insulin will go ahead and dock itself onto the surface and cause these openings to occur. This is just a really simplified explanation, okay? And so once you have these openings that open up, sugar can go in, it goes into the cells, you make energy, and everybody's really, really happy. Now, if you're one of these people that has blood sugars that swing up and down and up and down and up and down, the body doesn't like it and it shuts down and says, not going to do this anymore. And what will happen is, even though there's ample amounts of sugar here and the body increases the amount of insulin that's being signaled to create openings, the body's smart and goes, no, seen it before, not going to happen, not going to bring the sugar into the cells. And you notice, even with lots of blood sugar and lots of insulin, very little sugar goes inside the cells and the body quits making energy. And then you start to go, oh man, I need sugar, and the body releases more and more, and this cycle just perpetuates and you become resistant. That's where the term insulin resistant cells. You're resistant to bringing to the insulin, you're resistant to bringing sugar inside the cells for maintaining proper blood sugar. The idea is this: we want to, the one thing we have control over is our meals. So we can have a meal that creates a high spike in blood sugar and then come down here, or we can have a meal that creates a low spike in blood sugar. And that's what we're searching for: strategies to help take the meals that we eat and make them have less of an impact by reducing the amount of blood sugar. Now, you can do that by making sure that you include proteins and fats with each of your carbohydrate meals. And carbohydrates, your best bet is vegetables, because let me tell you, not only does it contain fiber to slow down the sugar response, it also contains the vitamins and minerals that our body needs. And the other thing it does is it feeds those gut bacteria, so those gut bacteria in turn help heal the cell. So this is some pretty good stuff. If you just make sure proteins, carbohydrates, and fats with each and every meal, and that you have a good amount of vegetables as your carbohydrate choice, then you'll go a long way to helping control these blood sugar levels. If you have low amounts of blood sugar, make sure you're eating something every few hours. Now, I'm talking about tiny little meals, little few nuts, 10 little nuts or something like that, the size of a quarter, whatever you want. Just something to try to keep your blood sugar stable. Make sure you're staying hydrated, like we talked about before, because you need water to be able to break down your foods and all the other processes that go on. Let's make sure that you start off with a good breakfast and do not skip that meal, and make sure that that breakfast contains lots of protein, because it's called the second meal effect, and it will affect the blood sugar regulation of the following meals you eat throughout the day. Start off with a good breakfast. Your mom was absolutely right. Let's reduce the consumption of high fructose corn syrup. Let's make sure that we eat lots of good fiber and good fats so we have good, healthy, happy membranes. Try to stay away from excessive coffee, and let's make sure you exercise. Now, there are some supplements that help support blood sugar regulation. A good multivitamin and mineral will go a long way to providing lots of things that you need. Good essential fatty acids will keep your cell membranes nice and healthy and happy. Magnesium glycinate is a fantastic form of magnesium that helps also regulate blood sugar and helps with the cell membranes. And for some folks, alpha lipoic acid would be a good choice for people that have problems with insulin resistance, or gymnema is a really good herb that can help. The final thing that people always ask me is, well, what marker should I have run? And that really depends on your individual health history and signs and symptoms. But I generally recommend this: a good blood chemistry panel, a complete white blood cell count with a differential. And what that means is not only do they test how many white blood cells you have, they tell you what kind you have. And that kind can tell you if you're having a problem with certain things, viral load or bacterial load. They tend to sway they tend to allow us to have an ability to differentiate. You want to look at your lipid profiles. You want to look at your cholesterol levels and your LDL and your HDL and your triglycerides, and making sure that comparing those with your glucose markers and making sure that you're able to break down your fats. You want to run a complete thyroid panel. We're not just talking about TSH. We're talking about TSH and the T4, which is what the thyroid hormone makes, and free T4, the amount of thyroid hormone that makes it the places that needs to go get converted, and the amount that gets converted, which is T3, and then free T3, the amount that makes it to each and every cell in the body. We also want to make sure that you run antibodies, because there's a lot of people that end up having issues with thyroid that really have to do not with thyroid but with the immune system. So we want to look for autoimmune thyroid as well. I recommend looking at fasting insulin, hemoglobin A1C, LDH, uric acid as part of that chemistry, making sure that's in addition to the chemistry panel. Let's look at iron and the ability to move that iron around, which is TIBC, and the ability to store iron, which is ferritin. It also can tell us a little bit about inflammation. A lot of these markers can tell us more than just the thing that we're looking for. Vitamin D levels, super important, helps to regulate the immune system. So much stuff happening with vitamin D, neurotransmitters, all kinds of stuff. And inflammation markers, let's take the time to look at those. C-reactive protein. Let's look at homocysteine and our ability to methylate. Let's look at fibrinogen. So these are the tests that I tend to recommend, including I like a B12 test as well, because that way I can see if someone's having a problem with methylation, if it's due to B12 or folates or whatever.
Well, that's it. Thank you very much for your time. If you'd like to find out more information on common health issues, you can check out my website at Functional Health for You. Under resources is a common conditions tag, and we talk about all kinds of various things. In addition, we just released a book called Eliminating the Pain of an Elimination Diet, a functional medicine approach to diet and health related issues. You can find it on Amazon.com. It talks about diet. It talks about non-dietary approaches to improving your health. It talks about roadblocks to your health. It talks about the elimination diet in detail. So check it out if you like. Thank you very much. Have a nice night.